In a tense courtroom, Karoline Leavitt faces off against Judge Victor Hensley, a smug tyrant hiding a multi-million-dollar scholarship corruption scandal. Armed with sharp evidence and unwavering resolve, she turns his insults into a stunning counterblow, leaving Hensley handcuffed right on the spot. Can justice prevail when the powerful fall? Watch this shocking story unfold. Karoline Leavitt had been in plenty of tense hearings before, but this was something else. Judge Victor Hensley wasn't just ruling from the bench. He was playing a game, a calculated, deliberate attempt to undermine her in front of the entire courtroom. But why? She could feel the weight of his stare as she moved through her arguments. Every word she spoke, he was waiting to pounce. She could practically see it, the slight curl of his lips, the slow tap of his fingers on the bench, as if he was daring her to keep going. She wasn't about to stop. "Your Honor," she continued, her tone measured, "these documents show a clear discrepancy in the funding allocations. The defendant's university received nearly triple the amount approved in the original budget for student scholarships, and none of it was accounted for in the state records." She turned slightly, her eyes scanning the hushed room, but her focus remained razor sharp. She gestured toward the projection screen where the financial statements were displayed. "Now, if you look here—" "Miss Leavitt," Hensley cut in, his voice carrying that same smug edge, "I hate to interrupt your presentation, really I do, but I think we've seen enough numbers for one day." Leavitt glanced at him, then back at the screen. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. "Your Honor, with all due respect," she said, her tone firm, "these numbers are the foundation of the case." "Right," he scoffed, leaning back in his chair, "and yet I fail to see anything that justifies wasting the court's time like this." There it was again, that phrase, wasting time. He was trying to bury this case before it even got off the ground. She heard a soft rustle behind her, the sound of the prosecution team shifting, exchanging looks. They felt it too, something wasn't right. Leavitt tightened her grip on her pen, flipping to the next page in her file. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion to—" "Denied," he snapped, silencing her. She looked up, her eyes narrowing. "I haven't even stated the motion yet." "And yet," Hensley said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the bench, "I can already tell you it's going nowhere." "Let's be honest, Miss Leavitt, this entire case is built on speculation. A little creative accounting, and suddenly you're crying corruption." The defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a navy suit named Thomas Bradley, smirked. He hadn't had to say a word. Hensley was doing all the work for him. Leavitt exhaled slowly, her voice steady but sharp. "Your Honor, are you refusing to allow my motion before even hearing its contents?" A pause. A beat too long. Then Hensley leaned back, his voice dripping with disdain. "I'm refusing to indulge this circus act any longer." The courtroom wasn't just tense now, it was shifting. Eyes darted, heads turned. Even the reporters in the back were scribbling faster, their pens scratching furiously against their notepads. Leavitt caught the glance of one of the jurors, a woman in her 50s, wearing a dark blazer named Margaret Evans. Margaret's brows furrowed, her lips pressed together. She wasn't the only one taking notice. The problem with arrogance, it makes people pay attention. Leavitt squared her shoulders, her voice calm but resolute. "Very well, Your Honor. Then let's proceed with the next piece of evidence." She turned back to the screen, her movements deliberate, her resolve unshaken. She clicked to the next slide, her voice steady but carrying a new edge. "This document, obtained through a subpoena, shows that—" "Miss Leavitt," the tone was different this time. A shift. She stopped, looked at him. Judge Hensley was no longer leaning back in his chair, no longer wearing that smug expression. His hands were clasped now, his mouth a thin, hard line. Something had changed. "Approach the bench." It wasn't a request. She hesitated, then set her papers down and walked toward him. The courtroom hushed as she reached the bench. He lowered his voice, just enough so only she could hear. "I'd strongly suggest you reconsider the direction you're taking here, Miss Leavitt." She tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me?" "I'm saying," he murmured, his tone icy, "that some fights aren't worth having." She let that sit in the air between them. Then slowly, deliberately, leaned in just an inch closer. "I don't scare easily, Judge Hensley." A muscle in his jaw twitched. She turned and walked back to her table, But that moment told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just a power move. It was a warning, a veiled threat disguised as judicial authority. But why? She had walked into this courtroom expecting pushback, maybe even hostility, but this was something deeper. Judge Hensley wasn't just biased, he was protecting something. Or someone. Leavitt adjusted a stack of papers, keeping her expression neutral. The prosecution team beside her shifted, waiting for her to react. She didn't. Not yet. Instead, she lifted her chin and faced the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to continue presenting my evidence." Hensley didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence linger as if deciding how far he wanted to push. Then finally he said, "Proceed, but keep it brief." Leavitt didn't acknowledge the jab. She simply reached for the next file. "This document is a contract signed between the defendant and the State Education Board outlining the proposed scholarship expenses. You'll notice that the listed cost total is just over $2 million. She paused, then, with deliberate precision, placed another sheet on the projector. "However, this is an internal ledger from the defendant's university, showing that the actual funds transferred were nearly double that amount." She placed a third document down. "And here is the approval signature, signed off by..." She hesitated, letting the weight of the moment land. "Judge Victor Hensley." The courtroom didn't just shift, it cracked. A ripple of movement, eyes darting, pens scratching. The defense attorney stiffened, his smug expression wiped clean. Judge Hensley didn't move. For the first time since she had stepped into this courtroom, his face was unreadable. Leavitt let the silence hang for a moment longer, then continued. "Your Honor, would you like to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction involving the defendant?" It was a calculated risk. She didn't have the full story yet, but what she did have was enough to shake the foundation beneath him. Hensley finally moved, shifting slightly in his seat, his fingers pressed together, knuckles whitening. "That document," he said slowly, "is inadmissible." Leavitt tilted her head. "How so?" "It was obtained improperly." She let that sink in. "Your Honor, this document was subpoenaed by my office." His nostrils flared. "Then it was mishandled. I'm ruling it inadmissible. It will not be considered by this court." This time the shift wasn't just in the gallery, it was everywhere. The jury, the stenographer, even the bailiff, everyone was watching. Leavitt crossed her arms, her tone calm but cutting. "You do realize this is a public hearing, correct? That the media is here? That every single person in this room just saw you declare critical financial evidence inadmissible without reason?" A muscle in his jaw jumped. "That's enough, Miss Leavitt." She didn't move, didn't blink. Then, slowly, she sat down. And that's when she did something that changed everything. She reached into her case and pulled out a small recorder, placing it on the table. She pressed play. A voice filled the courtroom, low, gruff, unmistakable. "Take care of it. I don't care how." The recording crackled, then continued. "Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those ledgers." Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Judge Hensley didn't move, didn't breathe. Leavitt didn't look at him. She didn't need to, because now every single person in the room had heard him, and the real game was about to begin. The recording ended, leaving nothing but thick, suffocating silence in its wake. No murmurs, no whispered speculation, just a stunned, collective realization. Judge Victor Hensley had just been caught. Karoline Leavitt didn't move. She kept her eyes fixed on the recorder as if daring him to challenge what had just been revealed. But he didn't. Across the courtroom, the defense attorney finally blinked, his composure slipping. The smirk was gone, replaced by something closer to dread. He glanced at his client, the wealthy dean whose empire had been built on backroom deals and political favors. The man looked pale. Judge Hensley cleared his throat, his voice strained. "Miss Leavitt, I don't know where you obtained that recording, but..." "That's not the question you should be asking, Your Honor," she interrupted, her voice unwavering. "The real question is, who are you talking to?" His fingers curled into fists. "This is outrageous," he snapped. This entire hearing is descending into chaos because of your grandstanding." "Chaos?" Leavitt repeated, her tone light, almost amused. "I'd say this is clarity. Finally, we have some transparency in this courtroom." The tension hitched up another notch. Leavitt let the moment breathe, let him sweat. Then she reached for another document and slid it across the table. "Your Honor, this is a transcript of a wiretap, legally obtained during our investigation." She tapped the top of the page. "It corroborates everything you just heard on that recording." Judge Hensley stared at the page but didn't touch it. His chest rose and fell, his breathing suddenly louder, more pronounced. Leavitt turned slightly, looking toward the bailiff. "Officer Michael Reed, would you kindly read the highlighted section aloud?" The bailiff hesitated, then picked up the transcript. His voice was steady, but the weight of the words made the room feel smaller. "We'll take care of her. Leavitt doesn't have anything solid yet, but if she does, I'll make sure it never sees the inside of a courtroom." A sharp inhale came from someone in the gallery. Leavitt folded her hands together. "I'd like to submit this as evidence, Your Honor." Judge Hensley's eyes flickered toward the side exit, a tiny movement, but enough for the room to realize that, for the first time, the man who had seemed untouchable was anything but. He was thinking about something other than his own arrogance now. He was thinking about escape. But it was far too late for that. "Motion denied," he barked, his voice sharp but carrying a faint tremor. Leavitt raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "This hearing is over," Hensley continued, his voice a fraction too loud, as if volume could mask his desperation. "I will not allow—" "Judge Hensley," Leavitt said smoothly, cutting him off, "I wasn't asking for your permission." And then she did it, the move she'd been waiting for. She turned toward the back of the courtroom and gave the smallest, subtlest nod. A door opened, footsteps echoed against the polished floor, and then a firm, authoritative voice announced, "Judge Victor Hensley, you are under arrest." Gasps erupted from every corner of the room. Reporters fumbled for their phones, cameras clicked, the jury gaped. Even the defendant, the powerful man who had expected this trial to be nothing more than a formality, looked genuinely stunned. Judge Hensley didn't turn. He didn't even speak, he just sat there, eyes fixed on a single point on his bench, as if he could make everything disappear if he just didn't move. But reality had already caught up with him. Karoline Leavitt remained seated as two uniformed officers flanked the judge. One reached for his arm, the other pulled out a set of cuffs. "This is absurd," Hensley muttered, though the fight had already drained from his voice. The officer didn't blink. "You have the right to remain silent," but for the first time in his career, Judge Victor Hensley actually was. The sound of metal clicking shut was deafening. The cuffs locked around Hensley's wrists, sealing his fate in front of the very people he had spent years ruling over. The once commanding figure behind the bench now sat frozen, his expression a mask of disbelief. The courtroom had erupted into stunned murmurs, disbelief crackling through the air like electricity. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their hands moving furiously across their notepads. Even the jury, bound by their duty to remain impartial, couldn't hide their shock. Karoline Leavitt stayed seated, her face unreadable. This wasn't about gloating. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. Judge Hensley finally found his voice. "You can't do this," he said, his words coming out low, almost a whisper, as if he himself didn't believe them. The officer holding his arm didn't flinch. "Sir, you are being taken into custody for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power. You'll have your chance to speak with an attorney." Hensley yanked against the cuffs, his face flushing. "This is a disgrace. I'm the law in this courtroom." Leavitt finally stood, straightening her blazer. "Not anymore." His head snapped toward her. For the first time, the arrogance had been replaced by something else, something closer to fear. The officers pulled him to his feet, but he resisted. "This is—" Leavitt shook her head. "This is accountability." The room went dead silent again, a lifetime of unchecked power gone in an instant. Hensley's face twisted, his jaw clenching as he turned to the gallery. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for an ally, someone who would stand up and declare this a mistake. But no one moved, because it wasn't a mistake. A few feet away, the defense attorney had gone ghost white. The dean, The man who had thought his influence could shield him wasn't faring much better. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, his breathing shallow. Leavitt let her eyes linger on him for just a second before turning back to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm and measured, "if you have anything to say, I'd suggest you save it for your arraignment." Hensley's mouth opened, then shut, because there was nothing left to say. The officers began escorting him toward the side exit, but before they could reach the door, the dean finally found his voice. "Wait. Wait." His chair scraped against the floor as he shot up, his eyes darting between Hensley and Leavitt. "This is getting out of hand. We can work something out." Leavitt turned, arching an eyebrow. "Work something out?" The man swallowed, visibly unraveling. I mean, there's no need for this kind of public spectacle," the dean, Robert Klein, said, his voice strained but trying to sound reasonable. "Let's be reasonable." Leavitt studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp and unyielding. Then she took a step forward. "You seem nervous, Mr. Klein." His mouth opened, but no words came. She tilted her head, her tone calm but cutting. "Why would that be?" He shook his head, forcing a laugh. "Nervous? No, this is insane. You don't seriously believe Hensley is guilty, do you?" Leavitt let the question hang in the air, the weight of it pressing down on the room. Then she spoke, her voice steady. "Do you?" Silence. The officers moved again, leading Hensley through the door. The moment it shut behind him, the weight of the moment settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was the unraveling of a system that had been protected for far too long. And Leavitt wasn't done yet. She glanced back at the jury, at the judge's empty seat, and then at the defense table. "I believe we still have a trial to finish." But after what had just happened, everyone in that room knew this was only the beginning. The courtroom felt different now, lighter, as if the weight of years of corruption had been lifted in an instant. Judge Hensley was gone, hauled out in cuffs, and the shock of it still lingered in the air like the final note of a symphony. Karoline Leavitt took her seat again, adjusting the papers in front of her. The trial wasn't over, not yet, but the biggest obstacle had just been removed. She turned her attention back to the defense table. Robert Klein, the dean, had gone eerily quiet. His usual smugness had been replaced by something colder, more calculating. He was still trying to assess how much damage had been done, how much of his safety net had just been ripped away. Leavitt could see the wheels turning in his head. Without Hensley on the bench, his legal team would have to argue the case on its own merits, and they had none. She leaned forward slightly, her tone calm but firm. "Mr. Klein, would you like to continue with today's proceedings, or would you prefer to discuss a plea?" His jaw clenched. "This is a witch hunt." Leavitt gave a small smile. "No, Mr. Klein, this is justice." He scoffed, shaking his head. "You think one corrupt judge changes anything? You think this means you win?" Leavitt didn't respond right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment sink in. "I think it means the system still works," she said finally. "That no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, the truth will always catch up to them." Klein exhaled sharply, but he had nothing left to say. The judge's seat remained empty, but it didn't matter. This case was no longer in his hands. The prosecution team exchanged glances, and one of Leavitt's colleagues leaned in. This might be a good time to push for a deal. Leavitt considered it, her eyes narrowing slightly as she weighed the options. She could feel the shift in the room, the jury's eyes locked on her, waiting, watching. They'd just witnessed something they'd never forget. But she wasn't about to let this end quietly. She stood. "Your Honor," she began, then paused, correcting herself to address the new presiding judge. "Given the events that have unfolded today, I'd like to formally request permission to proceed with additional evidence. It's clear now that a full investigation is necessary to uncover just how far this corruption reaches." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Leavitt pressed on, her voice unwavering. "Judge Hensley was only part of the problem. If my team was able to uncover this much, it means there's more. More names, more people who believe they were untouchable." She turned sharply to Klein, her gaze piercing. "So I'll ask you again, do you want to talk?" Klein sat rigid, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. He was weighing his options, the stakes clear in the silence that followed. He finally exhaled. "If I do, I want protection." Leavitt nodded slowly, her expression unyielding. "Then you better start talking." The courtroom was no longer the same place it had been an hour ago. The balance of power had shifted. The walls that once shielded the powerful had begun to crack, and Karoline Leavitt had sent a message to everyone watching: no one is above the law. As the bailiff called for order and the trial prepared to move forward, reporters in the back of the room scrambled to get their stories out. This wasn't just another case. This was history in the making, and it was only the beginning. Personally, I believe Karoline Leavitt's story highlights a truth we can't ignore. Corruption thrives in silence, but it crumbles when someone dares to speak. Her courage reminds me that justice isn't automatic, it's fought for, often against overwhelming odds. In education, where funds meant for students are stolen, the real victims are the future generations, robbed of opportunity. I see this as a call to action for all of us, whether in schools, offices, or homes, to challenge wrongdoing no matter how powerful the culprit. But I wonder, can one voice truly dismantle a system so deeply flawed, or is it just a fleeting victory? Some might argue the powerful always find ways to rebound, and real change is a fantasy. What do you think? Does persistence win, or are we just shouting into the void? Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share your views below. Let's debate this together.